Your vision of the West is notably dynamic. We see the West constantly remaking itself, driven by internal tensions and competition and by global influences. Could you comment on this sense of a dynamic West and how it was driven by these forces? What are some specific examples of this?
I think the dynamism of the West is clear from the beginning in ancient Greece. From the moment where we see this society emerging from the Bronze Age, they are sending out ships, they are founding colonies, they are founding trading places, they're engaging with other societies, they're working for them as professional soldiers. There's a kind of expansiveness to this story, and even in periods of, it's remarkable how, because there are many periods of retrenchment in Western history, expansion starts again. So the Roman Empire falls, not really dramatically in 476, but slowly over a century or two, in which it opens its borders to Germanic peoples who serve it as soldiers, and then to other Germanic peoples force their way in. Other kingdoms are founded within what had been Roman territory. But by the end of the 6th century, the church is beginning to send missionaries out on an extraordinary effort to teach the world, the European world, about the truths of the Catholic faith. They're sending missionaries all over the world, at a time when travel is incredibly difficult, when resources are very few. There's a kind of ambition and aggression which can be not just deeply unpleasant, but terrifying to be the object of. This is one of the ways in which, for example, Western civilization is very different from ancient Egyptian civilization. The Egyptians had a sense of living in a coherent world, spatially and biologically, governed by the Nile and its flooding, and they didn't see heroism as a virtue, and they didn't see going out and fighting with other peoples as something that you should be proud of, that would define manhood. Greeks and Romans and many other Europeans have had a very different view about that, often with terrible consequences for themselves or for those that they invaded. So that's just a European habit. It's one way you can really see this, I think, is the second great Greek poet, Hesiod, who appears in our book because he actually speaks for the farmer, the ordinary person. He says, at the beginning of one of his poems, every potter hates the other potter. Every craftsman is a rival of every other craftsman. This just seems to be a deep thing in the West.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think in the modern period, I think that what's so striking is how you have all of these different dynamic processes going on, which often are not entirely in people's control, and so they can't. These processes can't simply be stopped. I mean, these processes of international competition, of arms races, for instance, in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, these would be processes where, each country competing with the next for an advantage is going to keep on trying to develop a weapon which is just a bit more destructive, or ships that are just a little bit bigger. Industrial competition between firms and also between countries, again developing products that are better, trade routes that are more effective. All of these things. Once the process is set in motion, it's not easy to end it. I think warfare, unfortunately, has been one of the greatest examples of this. I think certainly in the 19th and 20th centuries, you have a phenomenon that we call total war, where countries are simply led to put ever greater resources in, feeling that they have to throw more and more in to make a total commitment to destroy the other side. And there's no way that they can get out of this until one side actually collapses. This was the case in World War I and then again in World War II. So there are many, many ways in which this dynamism is at work. And I think it's also very striking. I mean, looking across the whole broad scope of Western history, the extent to which some of the dominant stories in the West have always been about journeys and about progress. Starting with Homer's Odyssey, then thinking about Christianity, and imagining human lives as a journey towards something. In this case, towards heaven. Then in the Enlightenment, people seeing, starting to think of history as being a kind of journey that every society takes in sort of basically the same way, from early, quote, primitive societies, hunter-gatherers, towards sort of feudal agricultural societies, towards modern commercial, and finally towards industrial societies. So this sort of notion of movement, of constant movement, has always been, I think, a very important part of the way people in the West think about themselves and think about the world that they inhabit.